once more into the minefield. So, I know when I started doing LGBTQ plus representation in media topics that I was going to try and limit it to once a month, but I also did make the allowance for if stuff comes up, I might have to talk about it more. And there's been further wrinkles, both in the terms of Scarlett Johansson being cast in the project, which I talked about last time. She was originally cast to play a trans man. The backlash about that, I gave my feelings about that. And I kind of want to follow up on it, not just because of what happened since then, but because of some things that kept coming up in the comments of that video. So since we're doing this particular topic, that does mean we are going to swap out that. I'm going to get a little more relaxed with the look. So, to update you in case you weren't following, Scarlett Johansson has dropped out of the project. To reiterate quickly, the project was called Rub Tug. It was about a real-life trans man, Dante Tex Gill, who was around in the 70s into the early 80s running a chain of massage parlors that were actually houses of ill repute. He was running prostitution and was bumping up against the local organized crime by doing so. It's an interesting story. It's one worth telling. Now, since her departure, which was very clearly done in the wake of the controversy, and she put out a well-worded statement, I can't personally help but still feel a bit cynical about it, and that it's just a very well-worded PR Band-Aid, but it was well worded and it seemed well considered. So while I still have issue with everything that happened, the words she chose as she exited were well chosen. That being said, the director, Rupert Sanders, stayed on the project and is officially still on it, but basically the financiers are not particularly interested right now, and now they're shopping for a studio again, or at least they were last time I checked, which gives away the game that the people, the studio prepared to back it, were backing Scarlett's name and had little to no interest in the project otherwise. Now, some folks really took that as a validation that the only way that these stories can get told is to cast a big name actor, and obviously there's no trans man actors. I don't want to get too much into that element again, but I'll reiterate what I said before. There are other key roles that she could have played, and there are many indie films historically over the years that have been financed by getting a really big name for a supporting role. I mean, that's how Good Will Hunting got financed. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were nobody, but they managed to land Robin Williams in a key supporting role. And you could have easily put Scarlett Johansson, as the key supporting role to get the financial backing, to get, to put up front in the marketing so that you could get the financiers. She could have been Dante Gill's girlfriend, longtime girlfriend, which he did have. Could have been any number of other people. And the film still could have gotten done. So I will continue to make the argument it wasn't necessary to cast her in that role in order to still attach her to the project and get it made. But the thing is, ultimately, she doesn't appear to have gotten attached to this project because she felt the story needed to be told. She got attached to the project because she wanted to play that role specifically. And again, to be fair, these was the words of her rep, not her own exact ones, but she didn't really redact those. But her representative's response at the initial pushback being as dismissive as it was and citing a whole bunch of cisgender actors who have won awards playing transgender kind of really tipped the hand for why she had an interest in that part. But so that's the context in which I'm talking about this again. But I kind of want to springboard off that to talk about the bigger question that has come up, I think, in the wake of this. And it's a question that does deserve discussion because while it feels clear for me, and I think for a fair number of people on both sides of the argument that I'm about to talk about, there is a fair amount of nuance, and that's the thing. When you try and break it down to a simple bullet point, it just becomes a mess, but that's what people always try to do. the internet and the headlines and Twitter, even at 280 characters now, doesn't have the space for nuance. But I'm going to try anyways. So, should only trans people be playing trans actors? That is the question. It's a question that has been brought up both as a logic trap, which I'll get to the second half of that when it's being used that way, or as a legitimate question, from people trying to better understand the issues and the conflicts and the concerns that people have about these sorts of parts. So the argument basically goes something along the lines of, look, it's a part. They are an actor, and they are being called upon to play a part, and they're always going to be different from what the part is they are called to play. Actors fake accents all the time. Actors play roles that are slightly older, slightly younger than they themselves in fact are. People, there's a whole range of things that actors, for lack of a better term, fake. Why is playing a transgender character different from that? That is an argument that makes sense on its face. The issue is there are trans actors who are getting little to no work because they are trans actors, and because they are limited pretty much exclusively to playing trans parts. And very few parts are written explicitly to be played by trans actors, which means that there's a very small pool of roles that are viable for a trans actor to ever get to play. So it's a little bit galling when a cis actor swoops in and takes one of the few leading roles, potentially, away from trans actors who are really trying to cut it in this business. And again, especially when you're doing something that's a true story, to bring it back to the Scarlett Johansson thing, if you're trying to make a claim of this is a story that should be told, this is a community who has a story that should be told, to sort of shut that community out of the telling of that story is a bit conflicting. Let's go with that. We'll be polite and go with that. And sort of the other thing about that is, every now and then you will get, trans people playing trans parts, but by and large, especially lately, if it's a lead part, it's played by a cis actor. So, even if you take sort of the big breakout trans actor of the moment, which is Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black, her part was expanded as the show went on because she was really good in it, but she was a supporting character. And of course they were going to cast a trans actress there because she had to appear a bit different from everybody else. And that worked very well. And that's not me trying to knock Laverne Cox. Laverne Cox is beautiful and very passable, I feel. But, you could look at her and you could buy it, for lack of a better term. So when trans people get cast, they pretty much always get cast in supporting roles because the lead roles go to cis actors. They were the people that Scarlett Johansson's rep cited. You have Jeffrey Tambor, you have Felicity Huffman, you have Jared Leto, you have oh god, I've lost his name all of a sudden, from Breakfast in Pluto. He plays the Scarecrow in Batman. It's gonna come to me later, I'm gonna shout it out, but you know who I mean. So you have these cis actors whenever it's a lead, and there's more besides what I named there. Eddie Redmayne was another one. So Cillian Murphy, there we go. So when you have the lead roles always going to cis actors, that's a problem. And there's an additional layer to this, which I actually personally didn't even consider, because even though I made a go at acting in both Boston and New York, it never went anywhere, and I wasn't out as what you see. So my experience in trying to do that was basically as far as anyone was concerned, was a cis presenting person. So this is where I need to give credit. Riley Silverman, who is a comedian and an actress and a very funny person, She did an article, I might have been on Bustle. I gotta find it. I'll link to it below. But what she pointed out is that, and this is gonna feed into something that I'm about to bring up, which is that there are very few parts that are written to explicitly be played by trans people. But here's the other part of that. Because what people like to logic trap is when you try and make the argument that only trans people should be playing trans parts, whatever your reason for believing that. The flip argument of those who want to do the logic trap is go, oh, okay, so that means only cis people can play cis parts. Oh, we gotcha. Here's the thing, though. There are almost no parts that on a casting sheet explicitly describe a character as being cisgender. They just don't. They will explicitly describe a character as being transgender, usually because some element of the story requires that. But very few, almost never, is a character explicitly in a character description, the kind that is given to a casting agent, does it explicitly say cisgender. Basically, the only parts where that would have to be the case would, be some nature of depending on a family dynamic. So if we have a character who we know is the mother, as in like the biological mother of another character, okay, that's going to have to be a cisgender woman. Well, I'll backtrack. It doesn't have to be, because maybe one day in the future we'll get to the point where a trans person can play a cisgender person and no one bats an eye about it, but we're definitely not there. At this point in time, for it to be accepted, that would have to be a cisgender woman in that role. But you need to realize for any given movie, and especially when you're talking about a TV show, there are dozens, there are hundreds of parts. And I'm not even talking about extras here. I'm talking about one-line characters. I'm talking about characters who are parts of groups that, again, aren't just extras. They are cast to look a specific way and might even be named in the script, but maybe don't have any lines. There are all sorts of parts like that all over films, all over television, and they're never specified as cisgender. So if you're going to make the argument that only cis people can play cis characters, I would actually agree with that, but I would point out that it is incredibly rare that a character is ever specified to be cisgender, and that if they aren't, then it's a part that should be open to either or, which brings up another thing that came up in the comments a lot, which was people were making the argument, to touch back on Scarlett Johansson again, they were making the argument that it should go to the best person for the role, and they tried to say that's why she got the part. And you can make that argument if there is an audition process. If someone auditions, and properly in a case like this, auditions against trans actors as well, and is ultimately decided by the filmmakers to be the best person for the part, then you can still make the argument they are the best person for the role. Now, that's not going to still fly with everybody, understand that, but you can't make that argument in a case like what happened with Scarlett Johansson, because she and Rupert Sanders, the director they had worked before, they simply attached themselves to that project. There was no audition for that. She wasn't in consideration against anybody else, much less a trans actor. So she didn't beat anybody out for that. If you want an example of a cis actor playing a trans role where there was a very long, very extended audition process, that would be Hilary Swank in Boys Don't Cry. That movie almost didn't happen because they went through audition phase after audition phase after audition phase after audition phase and didn't think they could find anyone who could do the part, and eventually she did it. Now, I can't find a confirmation that they were actually auditioning trans men as well as cis women for that part, but knowing how things kind of were in the 90s when that movie got made, I could believe that if any trans men were auditioning, if they were either in a mid-transitional phase, didn't have facial hair yet, or were identifying as male, and weren't on hormone adjustments or whatever yet, that they would still be marked down as being women at the time. That's me kind of supposing. I don't actually know. So coming back to the original thing that I was saying. Well, not original thing, I'm jumping around, but where I was a second ago. So being a cisgender role, almost never specified, especially when you're talking about supporting cast. So I would make the argument that any role that does not specify should be open to both cis and transgender actors and should then go to whoever works in the part best. The problem is that presently, in the minds of writers, directors, casting agents, casting directors, and at this point still, I think, the majority of the movie-going audience, cisgender is the default. Cisgender is the norm. And this is not me arguing statistics. I know statistically it is far more common than any, gender variant, whatever the identification may be. But the point that I'm making about that is when a part is being cast, anything that is not specified tends to default to a standard template. And the standard Hollywood template has been white, 20s, cisgender. If a part is not specified as being anything other than those, it will default to that. And actually, I'd add a subcategory to male. Any part that is not a romantic part or is not, written specifically to be female and functionally in the story is a part that could work as either a man or a woman, historically has usually been cast as a man. Now, I kind of that's a little bit of an add-on because that was sort of the one that started to get the most emphasis being worked on. I think an attention towards the race issue is something that has been improving, and we are seeing more diverse supporting cast these days because people are trying to break the pattern of, well, they didn't specify, so they must mean a white person. And I would like to see the same consideration start to be given to cisgender. And again, I'm not saying that these parts should automatically be designated transgender. I'm saying that when it doesn't specify, it should be a properly open casting. But the reality of things right now is that is not the case. It's absolutely not the standard. Maybe it's in a couple sporadic cases where people are really putting in the effort to try and open things up more in the casting process, but that's just not where we are. So anybody saying, fine, trans actors for trans roles, that means cis actors for cis roles, I actually shrug and go, fine. But I'll point out the majority of roles don't specify either way, and those should be open to everybody. And they're just not. But more than that, it was an odd thing. I don't really have a place to put this in terms of where I'm forming my argument and everything I'm talking about, but I want to address it anyway because, for all the trans characters who have been played by cis actors, as I said, we don't have cis characters being played by trans actors. Except, because I know someone will bring it up, the Bond girl, quote unquote. People love to quote the trivia fact that there was a transgender Bond girl, except there wasn't, not really. What they're referring to is I believe the film came out in 81, I think. It was For Your Eyes Only. There's a scene at a pool. There was a large number of women in scantily clad swimwear. One of those women was a trans woman. Now, it got a little bit extra attention because it just so happened that as a publicity shot, they took a picture of Roger Moore, who was James Bond at the time, posing with all of these women. So it means that there is a shot of the official James Bond in an official publicity photo sharing a picture with a trans woman. Now, I have not been able to confirm whether or not anyone on set knew at the time that she was trans, but it didn't matter. She wasn't a Bond girl. She was a glorified she wasn't even a glorified. She was an extra. She's not a Bond girl any more than a random scientist fiddling a knob in Goldfinger's, sort of base gets to claim to be a Bond villain. When you say Bond villain, you mean the big villains. When you say Bond girl, you mean the main women that he's with. So, no. And not to mention, I would point to the fact that early 80s, Again, I think 81, but I could be off on my year. But early 80s. So if you can't find me an example that is, you know, better than almost 40 years old, that kind of illustrates the problem, doesn't it? And there is a problem. So let me come back to that question. Should only trans people, trans actors, play trans roles? Yes. Doesn't that mean that trans actors can't play anything other than trans roles? And doesn't that mean that everyone else must be locked down and you can't shift around anything ever? No. So this is where people like to, this is logically inconsistent and all this. Here's the thing. When people break these things down to try and do these logic traps, the way that you accomplish that is by stripping out all the nuance, is by stripping out all the circumstances, is by stripping out all the specifics that make the situation what it is. So I'm going to use a very pared down analogy that I'm hoping will illustrate what I'm trying to say. If we can hopefully agree as a starting premise that I would actually say LGBTQ plus in general, but we'll stick with trans here, that trans actors are not cast consistently, even in the parts written for them. They are undercast. They are underrepresented. So I'm hoping that you will accept that going in. Because if you're going to argue that with me, then, well, honestly, I'd like to think if you were going to argue even that point with me, you probably stopped watching before now. But whatever, we'll move forward. So imagine in your home, in some room, you have piles of stuff. Doesn't matter what it is. Absolutely does not matter. But you've got these piles of stuff, and some of the piles are bigger, some of the piles are smaller. And you decide, and you tell people, you know what? I think it'd be better if there was the same amount of stuff in every pile. You know what? I'm going to see what I can do about this. And you then proceed to start to take more stuff, and you're not taking it from anywhere, but you're just adding more stuff to the piles that have less, and you're not adding anything to the piles that are bigger. And then somebody comes in and goes, whoa. I thought you were all about equality. Well, yeah, I am. I'm trying to get everybody equal. It'd be nice for the symmetry, if nothing else. Well, no. See, because you're giving more stuff to the piles that have less, and you're not giving any stuff to the piles that are bigger. That's not equality. That's treating people differently. If you want equality, you should be giving the same amount of stuff to all the piles. But that won't change anything. The problem with trying to make an argument that says, well, if you want equality, why are you requesting to be treated differently than everybody else, is because we don't currently live in an equal society. And that's by no means exclusive to LGBTQ people. But we don't live in a state of equality currently. So when you try to correct that by giving what appears from the outside to be favoritism to those who don't have as much, that's trying to get everybody on an even footing, or as close to it as we can get. But anyone who says, well, no, true equality is everybody gets the same and nobody gets an advantage, all that does is maintain the status quo. You add the same amount of stuff to every pile of stuff. That gap between the piles that have more and the piles that have less never moves, never changes. So you can't insist that we begin behaving as if things were equal when they aren't. Once things get to a better state of equality, once we get to a point, as I said, when trans actors can be cast in a role originally intended for a cis person, or even where they are playing a cis person. The character is cis, the actor is trans, nobody says anything. If and when that ever happens, fine. Cis people can play trans actors because we will have reached the status of equal standing. That will be a point at which all things are equal. And then, yes, everybody can cross over. But we're not there yet. And behaving as if we are there when we aren't just embeds the problems that already exist. So I think I'm going to wrap up there. So the too long did not watch version is, at this point in time, I feel trans parts should be played by trans actors. And no, that does not mean that everyone has to be limited to being the only thing that they themselves are. Now, how do we ever get things to that even status so we get there? I don't know. I mean, I don't. I mean, I don't even know what I am. I'm a YouTuber. I'm an entertainment pundit, if I'm going to be pretentious about it. I'm not a sociologist. I don't know how to fix systemic problems. I don't claim to. But what I do know is behaving as if the problem doesn't exist, it'll never get fixed. So it's my hope that my readdressing this issue and addressing some of the stuff that came up in the comments from the last time I talked about it will give some folks a better understanding of what it was I was talking about. Because I actually had clips from that video pulled by a YouTuber about 20 times as big as I was, you know, cherry picking certain parts and sort of using it as a takedown. And again, a certain amount of it was that logic trap stuff that I mentioned, you know, where you strip out the nuance, or in the case of mine and another YouTuber's video, strip out the context of everything else that was said. And you know, you boil it down to these quick sound bites, and yeah, everything falls apart. And while the YouTuber himself, who I'm choosing to not name, while he in the video was a little bit dismissive, he wasn't rude. His viewers, his subscribers kind of descended on my channel, and I had about a week of really ugly, hateful comments that I had to clear out. And I haven't had to deal with a volume like that, I think, since I talked about Kathleen Kennedy last. And even in that, I was clearing out hateful comments directed at her and directed at primarily, you know, the creators I was talking about. Very few directed at me. I had to clear out a whole lot of stuff from commenters hatefully attacking me, and I know that they found that video because it was cited by this other YouTuber. And I don't know, I make no presumption that this guy watches my stuff. I suspect he did a search on some of the more viewed videos on the topic. Well, I say more viewed. The YouTubers that he picked were me and somebody who's about a little shy of twice my size, but still significantly smaller than he is. I find it interesting that he cherry-picked from people much smaller than him. And I have no assumption, and I'm sure a fair amount of you know who I'm talking about. I have no assumption that he will ever watch this, or that he would ever want to have a conversation, because I'm not opposed to trying. I can get angry over these things. But if someone is genuinely trying to understand, as opposed to undermine, belittle me, my life, and people like me, even if their starting position is one of disagreement, I will try to make them understand better. Not through lectures, but through a conversation. And that is why, at the end of every video, I ask, as long as you can keep the comments polite, no personal attacks, whatever your thoughts are, agree with me or disagree, drop something down in the comments, and let's talk about it. There's all the things to do. You know what they are. You don't need me to tell you. I will mention that the Patreon's the big one. But everything else, links in the description, including to the article that Riley Silverman wrote. I would encourage you to check it out. She was able to infuse her own personal experiences into that and make it a really relatable story, I think, even for people who don't have non-standard gender identity. So, yeah. Thanks for listening. If you're still here, God, I probably went on a long time with this. But until next time, this council is adjourned.